Ah! Greetings, brethren, Cloaking Donkey here, and I found a video on the internet that actually managed to trigger me quite hard. So, the video in question is Game Theory's latest video on For Honor. Usually, just like my videos, his videos are generally based entirely on gaming. They have no real impact on anything that is scientific or historical in any way. However, in this video, he decided to make some rather outlandish assertions about history, and that is simply something I cannot accept. And before I even get into the video, I am not a historical scholar myself. I just read a lot about this stuff because it interests me, okay? I'm into armor, into weapons, and all these things. I'm not a scholar though, so take my word with a healthy pinch of salt.
But which faction should you choose? Sure, I could just choose the one that's most in line with my personality, but screw that, I'm here to win! And past episodes here have shown that knowledge of cultural history can help you win games.
And then he goes on to say knowledge of cultural history can give you an edge, which means that right here he has presented the rest of this video as fact. And that is why I am so immensely triggered by this.
Let's start by getting our bearings. Between Vikings, knights, and samurai, there's almost 2,000 years of human history to cover, and that is a ton of time. You can imagine it creates a few problems with comparing these three groups. For instance, it may be easy to say that a European knight clad entirely in Gothic plate armor would destroy a Viking, but that's kinda like saying 10 dudes with M16s could have won the Revolutionary War.
2,000 years, huh? I'm not entirely sure what period he is talking about here. Because if you take knights, as in the stereotypical knight that we all know, and the stereotypical Viking that we all know, and the stereotypical samurai we all know, the margin is far, far, far smaller and goes far further into the modern days than you might think. The first sort of knights are around the end of the Dark Ages, so 9th, 10th century and going to the 11th century. Vikings, as they are known in popular culture, are much harder to pin down than that. Vikings aren't a cultural group or a standing within society. Viking is really a job. It derives from the Norse word viking and is really just something you do. And a Viking could be anything from just going to explore new territory and find places to settle to actually going and plundering and pillaging. And somebody going on a Viking is a Vikinger. But nobody was a Viking their entire life. If you're looking for the actual people behind the Vikings, those would be the Danes, the Jutes, and the Geats. And these people did exist for a very long time. However, that doesn't mean for that entire time they constantly went around plundering. So when you're talking about Vikings, you're specifically talking about the Viking Age, where most of this plundering, to our knowledge, happened. And that would be at the end of the Dark Ages and going into the medieval era, just like the Knights. We'll get more into the Vikings later, because that is definitely the part that triggered me the most. And the samurai we know have been around since the 10th century. They only really went out of fashion, if you will, in the 19th century, when industrialization just plowed them over entirely. So it's really only about 1,000 years that we're talking about here.
So in an attempt to make a fair comparison all around, you have to take into consideration time period. And to For Honor's credit, the game selected 3 types of warriors that were active in the world at the same time. When you draw a Venn diagram of all the time periods samurai, Viking, and knights were active, you get one major area of overlap, the 11th century, the year 1000.
Okay, so you just established that you want to focus on the 11th century. That means you have to be very, very specific about the things you talk about. And this is where I'm starting to have a problem with this video, because you did not do the required research to make such specific claims. You're going to be talking about the 11th century here, a time when Vikings and Knights didn't just exist simultaneously somewhere in the world, they happened to be in pretty much the exact same place, Europe, and they were interacting with each other a lot. And as I said earlier, Vikings themselves aren't a people. So when we talk about 11th century Vikings, we are basically just talking about the Danes at this point. And the Danes in the 11th century were not bloodthirsty savages. Their culture was just as advanced as the other cultures in Europe. And the only difference between them, the Franks, and the Northumbrians was that they were still polytheistic pagans when pretty much all the rest of Europe, except for some of the Slavic nations, had already surrendered themselves to Christendom. Technology-wise, these two groups were incredibly similar because they constantly traded and fought each other. Just like nowadays, we constantly trade with another and fight one another, and we kind of have the same level of technology in the Western world.
In this corner, coming in from Japan and standing at a whopping 5'3" they put the feud in feudal. It's the samurai! Hailing from the icy lands of Scandinavia with a height of 5'7" they take an arrow in the knee and keep on kicking. It's the Viking! And finally, coming straight out of the European Dark Ages in style, standing at 5'8" tall, he's your man in shining armor. It's the Knight!
Wait. Hold your jock jams. Are you serious? 5'3" tall. A Viking is 5'7" on average? I'm taller than that.
I like this little height comparison that he makes to somehow tell us that For Honor isn't historical. Dude, I don't need to see the height of these characters to tell you that this is not an historical game. But alright, fair point. The people back then surely weren't as tall as they are sometimes imagined. But would you like to wager a guess why the heights of the Vikings and the Knights are so similar back then? Because they are all very similar people. Because some of those knights, only a couple hundred years prior, were horrible Germanic savages. Some of those knights were horrible Celtic savages. And even at the time that we have chosen, the 11th century, there are Germanic savages being made into knights right now. Namely the Normans, because the Normans used to be Danes. They came to France because they wanted more land. Just like the Danes that went to North England to find more land to settle. And we'll get to why that is important in just a second.
Vikings come from Scandinavia, and the fact that Vikings had to live in this frozen nightmare without electric blankets and central heating should be enough credential to give them their badass card.
What are you even talking about? I mean, I don't want to necessarily drag up this old stereotype of the horrible American education system, but is this really what you think Scandinavia is? A horrible frozen wasteland of ice and nothing else? Dude, Scandinavia is not the North Pole. Now, I may be biased because I live in Germany, which is relatively close to Scandinavia, and I have been to Scandinavia. Most of Scandinavia is greener and more fruitful than the southern half of the United States, which is a barren, arid wasteland in comparison. Yes, it gets cold in the winter, just like it gets really, really hot in California in the summer. But that doesn't mean you can't grow anything there.
Since they lived in a place where food literally dies immediately,
Where food literally dies immediately? That is the most stupid thing I have ever heard. Seriously, have you never been out of California? Yes, even in the horrible ice-covered wasteland that is Scandinavia, you will find plenty of animals. And unlike California, half of them aren't snakes and spiders. And the Vikings were not a bunch of SoCal pussy vegans. Also of note, it is a very well-established fact that temperatures during the 10th, 11th, and 12th century were much higher than they were during the Renaissance times and before that. It's actually so much of a thing that there's a term for it. It's the medieval warmth period, which means that even in the frozen wasteland of Scandinavia, it was probably not actually that frozen at all.
stayed alive almost entirely by stealing from other people. They did this by striking hard and fast at vulnerable targets like monasteries and wealthy villages.
Sorry, but this is probably one of the silliest points you make in this entire video. Just ask yourself, how would a society live entirely on what they plunder from overseas? So you're trying to say that these people who lived in a frozen wasteland with entirely no resources had to go on voyage pretty much every week to get food, supplies, and any resources that they needed on their tiny longboats and bring it back home. This is what I hate about Hollywood and popular culture. Somehow they think that the Vikings were just this little tiny group that was scattered across Scandinavia, and to survive in this barren wasteland, they had to go some other place to scrounge for scraps left over by the Christians. When in fact the reason for them to even go some other places is that they had so much damn food that there was immense overpopulation, which then caused them to not have enough resources for everybody, and they decided to go other places and settle, which is exactly what the Danes did all throughout the end of the Dark Ages and the Viking Age, which is why it is even called the Viking Age, because they went all over Europe, places such as Germany, France, England, Poland, and even Russia, to settle because there were just too damn many people in Scandinavia, which was not a barren wasteland but produced so much damn food that people lived in relative abundance
before fading into the foggy mists on their massive warships.
Massive warships. Yeah, longships really aren't that big. Actually, they are specifically built relatively small for speed and ease of transport on land. And fun fact, they have absurdly cute names such as Karvi and Snekja.
Their weapons were generally garbage. Again, that whole frozen tundra thing.
Ugh, God. The Danes made some of the best swords at the time. Their metallurgy was excellent, you Google impaired hack. You are the one who chose the 11th century. The 11th century, pretty much all the weapons across Europe were excellent, but they were also all pretty damn similar. So any weapons you attribute to the knights, i.e. swords and spears, you will also find with the Vikings.
With only the most basic of offenses, a bow and a shield on their back, a spear for throwing, and an axe in their belt.
A spear for throwing. Okay, let's get one thing straight. Pretty much during the entirety of the Dark Ages, 1,000 years before that, and into the medieval era, the spear was the standard weapon for pretty much every soldier/warrior. The reason for this being that the spear is incredibly effective for how cheap it is to produce. The giant longsword or two-handed swords that are used in For Honor, that stuff all came later when the spear kind of went a little bit out of fashion. At this time you're looking at short and broad swords, generally not longer than 1 meter to 1.10 meters in total. And all of these hand axes, short swords, broadswords, syaksas, etc. would be used as sidearms. When you were too close to use your spear effectively, you would then use your sidearm, or when you lost your spear, anything like that. But the main weapon for all of these people were spears. Even those knights used spears. So don't you dare knock my spear as though it's just a random javelin people carry around. Spears are fucking awesome, and you better respect them.
Or, if they were particularly well off, a seax, a sort of short sword knife hybrid that was perfect for up-close encounters.
A seax or syaksa is not a rich person's weapon. In fact, this is a weapon that a lot of people were carrying back then. The first ones to use these were the Saxons and Anglo-Saxons, and they did because they turned out to be incredibly effective, and they were comparatively cheap to make and could not only be used as a weapon, but also as a tool for many things. You should look at the syaksa more as a machete of its time. But unlike the short swords and broadswords, it was not necessarily a sidearm. It was more just a knife type thing that people just carried around because it was incredibly useful and small. Now there is also a longer version of the syaksa, the langa syaksa, which was more of the length of a regular sword and then would actually be a sidearm. And because a lot of the lower born warriors were used to the syaksa as, a weapon, they were far more comfortable with a longer version of it than a sword, which does certainly work differently as a weapon when using it.
But if they were minimal on the offensive front, they were practically nudists on the defensive front. Vikings, as if going for maximum machismo, were practically nothing for protection from either people or the threat of icicles to the crotch.
Okay, this is entirely and 100% bullshit. I mean, seriously, only a couple of minutes ago you asserted that these people come from a arid, frozen wasteland of horribleness, and then you're trying to tell me that they run around naked? Who comes up with this shit? There are certainly examples from antiquity of warriors running around naked to intimidate the enemy, to say, haha, look, we are so blessed by our gods, we don't need any clothes or armor. They were the warrior trolls of their time, if you will. But from historical evidence, this is generally more attributed to Celtic tribes and Germanic tribes. There are plenty of illustrations of Helvetii, Gauls, and Iceni going to war naked with the Romans, which is quite a long time before the Vikings that we are talking about here. These Vikings of the 11th century certainly were not going to be naked. Most of the people who went on a Viking, the Bondi, which were just sort of your average guy with a bit of depth or trying to establish himself as a mighty warrior for the ladies, or whatever reason he had to go and burn down a couple of churches, would probably have gone on that first Viking just wearing their regular clothes. And maybe if they had a little bit of money saved up, they would buy themselves a little bit of a helmet. But that same fact actually goes for the majority of warriors that would have fought on the side of the knights. And in fact for the Japanese armies, which in the 11th century would be peasants in service of the land-owning samurai. So if you're going to take samurai and knights, which are arguably the elite forces of their nations, you should really also take the Hirdmana, which are the elite forces of the Vikings. And these would wear pretty much the exact same gear as the knights of the time, which is mail armor, or more colloquially referred to as chainmail, over their torso, their upper arms, going down at least half the length of the legs, and then wearing an iron helmet, and carrying a shield, a spear, and a broadsword. Now we have a fair comparison.
Wealthiest Vikings wore hardened leather, but most just had quilted fabric.
Oh my god, here we go with the fucking leather armor again. I talked about this at length in my video about armor in Camelot Unchained. No, there is no historical evidence whatsoever that leather armor, except for hard-boiled leather armor, was ever a thing that was widespread. Leather was used in various armor, such as the wispy coat of plates, such as various scale mail for protection of the metal, because the metal for armor at that time was usually iron and was very susceptible to rusting. So covering the outside of it with leather was a good idea because it kept the rainwater off the metal. But armors like the one you are showing here, probably, most likely, relatively undoubtedly, did not exist. There is no evidence for it whatsoever. This is as far as I got the first time I watched this, because I was so incredibly triggered. What you are showing here is a live role-playing invention. People came up with leather armor for LARP and for RPGs and all this other fantasy stuff because it is cheap today. And you are not actually fighting today, you're just playing. And so these armors don't actually have to be good enough to hold back a sword. And I will put in another card right here that will send you over to Skullagrim, who made a perfect video about these leather armors and how absolutely crap they would really be.
Now, to For Honor's credit, the game gets all of this right. One look at the warlords, berserkers, and raiders, and you immediately see light armor, if at all, and rudimentary shields and axes.
Rudimentary shields and armor. Okay, once again, For Honor, not a good reference. Simple, okay? Danish weapons, shields, and armor at that time were not rudimentary. They were finest of quality, just as good as you would find all over Europe. Slightly different in style, that's true. Round shields were kind of going the way of the dodo at that time, and people were using kite shields. But there is something to be said for round shields, and round shields were certainly not ineffective. They just kind of went out of style because they're not as good when you're on horseback, and being on horseback became more and more popular outside of the Danish kingdoms.
Even the Valkyrie is appropriate, as Viking culture required men, children, and women to know how to fight.
First of all, there's no such thing as Viking culture. What you're talking about here is pre-Christianized Danish and Germanic culture. And yes, these cultures certainly encouraged everyone to know how to fight, because they operated on entirely different moral and ethical codes. Our modern thinking a lot of the times derives from Christianity, in which you're not supposed to solve your problems with violence, you're supposed to turn the other cheek and all this stuff. None of these moral principles really applied to the pre-Christianized Germanic and Slavic cultures. They didn't much care about turning the other cheek. They were very territorial and very much based on survival of the fittest. And so yes, everybody was supposed to be able to fight, and sadly a lot of modern minds turn this to mean that there were just as many female soldiers as there were male soldiers. Which is most likely not true. I don't want to get too much into this because it would be just another 20 minutes of me explaining stuff. But just think about it, if there was really this crazy pagan army of half women when everybody else was already pretty much Christianized and sporting entirely male armies, wouldn't that be something people would say, wow, that's crazy, look at them, half of their fighters are women folk, we should probably write this down because it's interesting. There are some sources of this, some even famous, such as Boudica. But usually when women appear in the armies, it was when they were already defending their last home and hearth. And that is exactly the point. That's where Shield Maiden comes from. It's an entirely defensive concept to begin with. So no, women would most likely not be going on Viking. I'm very sorry.
So you're probably wondering, why did Vikings wear the medieval equivalent of tissue paper? Sounds like a bad idea for a society built around fighting and raiding, right?
And this is the problem with videos like that. Because he asserted that this is the case, he now goes on and brambles on in this crazy tirade of nonsense that is just based on a garbage hypothesis. I don't really even have to respond to this, it's just bullshit.
One, they got around by boat all the time, and you don't want to go overboard in iron. Anchors away! Also, iron rusts into powder in the presence of salt water, so not the best idea.
Oh god, yes. Yeah, the reason they didn't wear any iron armor is because of rust. No, just no. This is stupid. People nowadays always like to make it seem like the people in the medieval times didn't know what the fuck they were doing. In fact, these people knew exactly what they were doing in context of what they were doing every day. So some of the things they did may seem outlandish for us these days. Such as people going on Viking without any armor. How can they? If they're so poor, why don't they stay at home? And to demonstrate, let me ask you this. With all your fancy 21st century knowledge, if I gave you a stick and a board of wood, could you make fire with that? Do you even know how that works? Do you have any idea where to even start on that? The answer is probably no, and that's okay. Because nowadays, you can just go and buy a lighter, an electric lighter, and it will do all the work for you. And that is fine because in relation to your daily life, making fire isn't something that you need. It's not important to you. But conversely, pretty much everyone watching this video will absolutely be able to operate a smartphone if I give you a smartphone. The people back then were not stupid in relation to their daily lives. Things that were commonplace to them, such as iron armor, they knew very well how to operate.
2, wearing light armor allowed them to have maximum mobility. When you're jumping off a ship to raid a lightly guarded town, you don't want to be weighed down by unnecessary armor even if you've been keeping up with leg day.
Oh my god, this is also one of those horrible, horrible myths that just will not die. Armor does not slow you down that much, okay? I have worn a lot of armor in my time of just role-playing and doing reenactment. You can move just fine with it. If you are a little bit fit, it practically doesn't slow you down at all. It reduces your overall stamina, sure, so if you're trying to run a marathon in your mail armor or your plate armor, then you're probably not gonna do as well as if you did it without the armor. But for just short-term fighting and mobility, it's absolutely not a big problem. You can go around YouTube and find plenty of videos of people doing somersaults in plate armor, swimming in mail armor, which is something I've done myself, by the way. It is really not as big a deal as people make it out to be.
These guys are dead as soon as they hit the battlefield. Let's play it out. The Viking sprints into the arena, chest bared in a daring display of bravery, and ooh, there's a samurai arrow in the back. Oh, and that's the knight's blade to the side.
This is so stupid. Earlier, even you said, the basic Viking only carries a bow and a shield and a spear for throwing. And now suddenly, he doesn't have a shield to guard himself against the arrow from the mighty samurai, and he doesn't have a bow to shoot back. Seriously, why can you not even be consistent within your own argument?
The Viking makes one last-ditch effort swinging his axe, but it's rejected. His rudimentary armaments are no match for the finely crafted weaponry of the knight and the samurai. Some armor beats no armor, bro.
Yep, pretty much already said everything that needs to be said about this. It's complete bullshit. You have no idea what you're talking about when it comes to the Vikings. So let's see what else you have to say about knights and samurai, shall we?
You can shout as much as you like, berserkers, but it ain't gonna stop a knight's arrow into your chest.
Oh, so the knights have bows as well now. Did they steal it from the Vikings? Is that why they don't have bows anymore? Come on, knight, why do you have to be a thief?
Huge castles became the norm because they offered protection from the poorly equipped raiding parties. A group of Vikings coming for your stuff? Well, just haul butt into your castle, close the doors, and wait for them to leave. What are they gonna do? Flex their pectorals intimidatingly at the front gate, hoping that it crumbles in fear? I don't think so. And with castles came knights, mounted warriors with heavy offense and defense.
And with the rise of castles came the cavalry. For you just have to play Total War to know the best thing to have when you're attacking a castle is loads of cavalry. For they can ride against the wall like a tide of iron and bring it down with their sheer mass and power. Come on, this is nonsense. Also, the picture you have in the background, that is not 11th century knights. 11th century knights, as already established, to look actually very similar as the elite troops of the Vikings during that era.
Pole arms would allow you to attack others from horseback fairly easily without dismounting,
and more 12th century crusaders. Seriously, these pictures in the background piss me off so much, because it would have been so easy for you to just do a Google search of literally 11th century knight, and you would have found what knights in the 11th century looked like. I just don't understand why you insist on establishing the stupid time period of 11th century and then constantly break it yourself.
But remember, samurai made it rain, so no worries for them there. In short, their motto was to keep your opponent at a distance, riddle them with arrows, and overpower them with your excessive bank account.
This is such bullshit. Are you really asserting that only the samurai used bow and arrow at that time? No, bow and arrow was used across the damn planet. And yes, even those Vikings, who you already said at the beginning had bows that they carried into battle, everybody was using archery.
If Batman were a medieval warrior, he'd be a samurai, zipping around on his Batmobile horse and smacking villains in the face with his wads of cash.
You think you have a chance against me? I'm rich. I'm Samurai Batman.
I know this is a completely petty side point, but this is exactly why I don't watch your channel anymore. All of this ADHD herb, so edgy and so full of pop culture references, just fuck off.
Sure, once they got equipped with a katana in later eras, like you see in For Honor, they were fine. But in the 11th century, they were incredibly susceptible to close-ranged combat. So to counter this, they usually had an entourage of people equipped with polearms and swords to keep them protected from enemies just running up and taking down their horse.
Yes, whereas Vikings and knights always fought entirely by themselves and not in armies or war bands whatsoever. Yeah, I think I'm pretty much done with this video. I don't know how much more bullshit is in it, but at this point I just can't take it anymore. Sorry MatPat, but this is probably the worst video you have ever made, and it is filled with so much bullshit, recited as fact, that you should not only get rid of this video, you should apologize for it. And why should you apologize? What's your crime? Your crime is that 1.5 million people saw this and almost 70,000 of them thought it was a good video. Videos, movies, TV shows, articles like this, filled with nothing but misinformation, is what creates all of these shitty, misinformed, bullshit myths about history. I'm sick to death of it. If you don't know that much about history, that's totally fine. Read up on it, watch videos on YouTube. There are plenty of people on YouTube like Lindy Beige and Skullagrim who know what they're talking about when they come to these topics. But you, Matt, know nothing about this. Your entire knowledge seems to be based off of Hollywood and your Californian school system that doesn't seem to cover anything before the 16th century. Please just stop and think about what you're doing here. You're filling people's heads with absolute garbage. I mean, for example, I don't know very much about game design and the theory of making games, which is why I would never make a channel such as yours. And I would expect the same courtesy from you to just stay out of things that you don't know anything about. Alright, that's an incredibly long ranty video that not a lot of people are gonna watch to the end probably. If you however did and you are currently watching this, please do me a favor and write a comment that says Jammy Dodger so I know that you are the bestest of dudes. And I'm gonna go back to making actual gaming content and not getting triggered by people who don't know what the fuck they're talking about. But until then, I've been the Cloaking Donkey and I'll see you in another video!